The ink was still wet when Lady Marbury's fan stopped moving. It was the 3rd morning of March, in the long gallery at Ashcombe Hall, and 11 people had been assembled to watch a marriage undone. The solicitor had spread the papers across a card table that had never in its life held anything heavier than a hand of whist. The windows behind him ran floor to ceiling, and the light coming through them was the pale washed light of a Wiltshire spring, and it fell across the table and across the woman seated at it, and it did not flatter her. Her name was Honora Vane, and she had been the Countess of Ashcombe for 211 days. She wore grey, not the grey of half-mourning, which would have suggested she considered the marriage a death, but a plain, sensible grey wool that had been made for her in the 2nd year of her father's illness, and had been turned once at the hem since. Around her the room was silk. Lady Marbury's fan was ivory. The rival Miss Georgiana Fenn wore a gown the color of new cream with 3 rows of pearl buttons that must have taken her maid a quarter of an hour to fasten. Honora's gloves were mended at the left thumb. She had mended them herself, at 11 o'clock the previous night by a single candle, because she had known this room would be watching her hands. She took the pen. She dipped it. And she smiled. The smile was not large. It did not show her teeth. It was the smile of a woman remembering something pleasant at an inconvenient moment, and it lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and in those 2 seconds Lady Marbury's fan stopped moving and did not resume. Across the table, standing. Not sitting, because he had refused the chair the solicitor offered him. The Earl of Ashcombe watched her mouth. He was 34 years old. His name was Adrian Rowe, and he had a jaw that looked as though it had been cut rather than grown, and he had not spoken in 11 minutes. He watched her sign her given name. He watched her sign her surname. He watched her set the pen down and turn it a quarter turn, so that it lay parallel to the edge of the paper, which was a thing she did with pens, a thing she had always done, and which he had noticed in the 2nd week of their marriage, and had never mentioned to anyone. He did not know yet what the smile meant. Neither did the room. That is the part worth staying for. The room had decided, sometime in the previous autumn, exactly what Honora was. Lady Marbury had put it into words at a supper in November, leaning toward Miss Fenn behind a lifted fan in a private aside that had carried farther than she intended. "The bookkeeper," she had said. "That is all she is, my dear." He married a bookkeeper because the estate wanted one, and now the estate has one. And he is free to be sorry. The word had traveled. It had traveled the way such words do, from fan to fan, from carriage to drawing room, until by Christmas the neighborhood had settled it. The Countess of Ashcombe was a bookkeeper who had been lifted above her station by a man in financial distress, and she would be set down again the moment the distress passed. Honora had heard it. She had heard it in the vestibule at Marbury Court while she waited for her cloak, and she had stood very still, and the only thing her body had done was a slow deepening of color at her wrists, above the line of her gloves where nobody was looking. She was 25 years old. Her father, Josiah Vane, had been a wool merchant in Devizes, and a good one, and an honest one, and he had died in the 2nd week of the previous June, with a great deal of money and a great deal of unfinished business. Honora had kept his books from the age of 16. She had kept them because her mother was dead and her father's clerk drank, and because she had a mind that liked columns, and by the age of 20 she was doing more than keeping them. She was reading them. There is a difference. A clerk records what has happened. Honora had learned to see what was about to. Her wound was not poverty. She had never been poor. Her wound was a sentence she had overheard through a study door when she was 19, spoken by a gentleman who had come to ask her father for her hand, and had been discussing terms. First useful. The gentleman had said, she would be very useful. Her father had refused him, and Honora had never told her father why she was glad, and she had carried the word for 6 years the way one carries a stone in a shoe. Useful. Not chosen. Never chosen. Wanted the way a good ledger is wanted, and set on a shelf when the accounts are closed. That is the belief she had carried into Ashcombe Hall in the August after her father's death, when she married a man who needed £31,000 and had a name to trade for it. The Ashcombe entail was a thing of beautiful cruelty. Adrian had inherited 11,000 acres, and a debt against them of £31,000, contracted by his father across 2 decades of bad harvests and worse advice. And the mortgages were held by a consortium of Bath bankers who had begun in the spring before the marriage to speak of foreclosure. The land could not be sold. The entail forbade it. It could only be held or lost entire. Honora had brought £31,000. The settlement had been drawn in 4 days. If you have ever watched 2 people be introduced to each other in the same hour they are joined, stay with this one. What happened at Ashcombe that autumn was not what the neighborhood believed, and the difference is the whole of the matter. She arrived at Ashcombe on the 14th of August, with 2 trunks, one of which held her father's ledgers. The hall was worse than she had been told. The east wing had been closed for 9 years, and the roof over it had begun to open like a book. The home farm had been let to a tenant named Prentice, who had not paid rent in 14 months because the drainage in the low meadow had failed, and he could not grow anything but rushes. The steward, a man of 60 named Wickham, met her in the courtyard and looked at her the way one looks at weather. Wickham walked her through it that first afternoon because there was nobody else to do it, and he did it the way a man reads a list of the dead. The gallery, the morning room, shut. The state bedroom, shut. The chapel with a cracked pane over the altar that had been cracked, he said, since before the old Earl died. In the yellow drawing room, the chairs stood under Holland covers in a shape she thought at first was furniture, and then understood was absence. 20 chairs for 20 people who had stopped coming. She put her hand on the back of one, and the dust came away gray on her mended glove, and she did not wipe it off. "How many indoor servants?" she said. "9, my lady." "For how many rooms?" Wickham did not answer that. It was the first honest thing he did for her. Adrian did not meet her. He was at the far end of the south terrace when her carriage came in, standing with his back to the house, entirely still, one hand at his coat pocket. She saw him from the carriage window as they came around the drive. He did not turn. That was her first sight of her husband since the church, and she filed it where she filed everything. He came to dinner. He sat at the head of a table that seated 30, and ate at one end of it, while she ate at the other, and the footman carried plates the length of the room in silence. He asked her whether her rooms were satisfactory. She said they were. He asked whether she required anything. She said she did not. He said, in a voice that was level and low, and gave away nothing at all, that Wickham would attend her in the morning if she wished to see the accounts. She had not asked to see the accounts. She had not mentioned the accounts. He had offered them before she asked. She lay awake in a cold bed and turned that over, and could make nothing of it. Wickham brought her the books at 9. He brought them. She understood at once, expecting her to look at them for a quarter of an hour, and thank him prettily. He set them on the table in the morning room in a stack, 4 of them, calf-bound and swollen at the spine with damp, and he stood back with his hands folded and waited to be thanked. She opened the top one. She read the first page and turned it. She read the second page and turned it. Wickham cleared his throat at the quarter hour, and she did not look up. He cleared it again at the half, and she said without raising her eyes, "You may sit down, Mr. Wickham, or you may go. You may not hover." He went. He came back at 1 o'clock with a tray, which was not a thing he had ever done for anyone, and found her exactly as he had left her, with the second volume open and her lips moving. She looked at them for 5 hours. She had them again the following day, and the day after that. And on the 4th day she came down to the study with 3 of them under her arm, and a slip of paper in her hand, and asked Wickham whether he could explain to her why the timber receipts for the Kingsdown plantation had been entered twice in the credit column for 1812, and once in 1813, and not at all thereafter. Wickham could not explain it. Adrian, who had been standing at the window with his back to them and who had not been asked, turned around. "Say that again," he said. She said it again. He crossed the room and stood over her shoulder, while she put her finger on the entries, and she became aware of him there. The heat of a man at her shoulder in a cold room, and her hand on the page did not move, but her breath went shallow and she despised herself for it. "How much?" he said. £218, she said. "Against the estate, every year for 9 years. The plantation has been cut and sold, and the money has gone somewhere that is not this book." Adrian looked at the page for a long moment. Then he said, "Sit down. You have been standing since 9. She sat down. She sat down because she had been ordered to, and she felt the order. As a slight, and she did not notice for another 2 months that he had been the only person in that house to observe how long she had been on her feet. That was the first of them. There were others. "Eat something," he said, in the breakfast room in September when she had been at the rent roll since dawn. "Come inside," he said. In October, when she had walked the low meadow with Prentice in the rain to see the drainage for herself, and had come back with her hem black to the knee. "Stop," he said once, in November and nothing else. When she had been reading a column of figures by candlelight for so long that her eyes had begun to water, and he took the candle and moved it 3 inches closer to the page and left the room without another word. Cret. She read every one of them as coldness, as a man managing an asset. "Useful," said the stone in her shoe. "Useful, useful, useful." The neighborhood read them as nothing at all, because the neighborhood never saw them. What the neighborhood saw was the first ball of the season at Marbury Court, in the first week of November, when the new Countess of Ashcombe came down the receiving line in a gray silk that had been made over from her mother's, and stood among 200 people wearing the year's diamonds. Lady Marbury was 61. She was Adrian's aunt by marriage, and she had raised him from the age of 9 when his mother died. And she had spent 30 years arranging the county the way a woman arranges flowers. She had a habit of holding her fan a half-inch too high when she was recalculating rank. She held it there when Honora was announced. Miss Fenn stood at her right hand. She was 22, with 4,000 a year, and a mother in Bath, and a face that had been told since childhood exactly what it was worth. And she had been intended for Ashcombe since she was 15. She had been told so. She had built a life on it. When Honora came into the room, Miss Fenn's chin lifted a fraction, and her hands folded in front of her, and she looked at the gray silk with an interest that was not unkind, and was not curiosity either. It was measurement, and Lady Marbury said, in a public exchange, in the middle of the room, in a tone pitched to carry precisely as far as she wished, and not 1 inch farther. "You must not be shy of the accounts, my dear. A bookkeeper among us is a novelty. Do tell us if the punch is over budget." There was laughter. It was not cruel laughter. It was worse than cruel. It was the laughter of people who found the observation apt. Honora heard it move outward from the center of the room, the way a stone's ring moves outward on a pond. It reached the card tables. It reached the terrace doors where a young man laughed a half-second late because it had been repeated to him. It reached a knot of women by the orchestra who laughed without knowing what they were laughing at, which is the way most of it is done. She counted, because counting was what she had instead of weeping. 200 candles in the room, at perhaps 3 shillings the pound. The orchestra at 8 guineas. The supper at £40 if it was at a penny. She stood in a made-over gown, among 400 pounds of one evening, and thought quite clearly that the low meadow at Ashcombe could be drained for less than what this room would burn before midnight, and that Lady Marbury had never in her life been obliged to know that, and that being obliged to know it was the whole of what the word bookkeeper meant in her mouth. Honora's fan did not move. Her mouth said, "Your punch is excellent, madam." Her hand at her side closed on a fold of gray silk so tightly that the mark of it stayed in the fabric for an hour. And on the far side of the room, Adrian Rose set down a glass he had not drunk from, and looked at his aunt for the space of 3 seconds with a face that had gone entirely still. Nobody saw it but Honora. She saw it, and she did not know what she was seeing. The low meadow was drained by the end of November. It was drained because Honora had walked it in the rain, and had gone back the following week with Prentice and a spade, and had knelt in 20 acres of standing water in a gown she never got clean again, to find the old stone drain her husband's grandfather had laid in 1790, and his father had let silt close. She had found it on the estate map first, in the muniment room, on a sheet of vellum so brittle that she had weighted the corners with candlesticks rather than hold it. A line of brown ink running north to south under what was now rush and standing water. Prentice had told her there was no drain. Prentice had farmed that ground for 19 years, and his father before him, and there was no drain, and there had never been a drain. "There is a drain," she said. "Your father was not told about it. It was cut before he was born." They walked it in the rain on a Tuesday. The water came over the tops of her boots in the first 100 yards, and after that it did not matter. She had the vellum in an oilcloth under her arm, and she paced the line off the hedge, counting her steps aloud, and she was wrong twice, and the third time the spade went in and struck stone 18 inches down and rang. Prentice took his hat off in the rain and looked at the hole. 19 years, he said. She knelt down in the water and put her bare hand into the hole, and felt the shaped edge of a stone a man had cut and laid in the year 1790, and she began, with her hand, to pull the silt out of it. It cost £400 to clear. She found the £400 by refusing, without telling anyone, to replace the carriage horses that season, and by selling a set of silver she had brought from Devizes that had been her mother's. She did not tell Adrian about the silver. She told Wickham it had been sold, and instructed him to say nothing. And Wickham, who had begun by December to look at her the way one looks at weather one has learned to respect, said nothing. What she did not know was that a boy from the home farm had seen her on her knees in the water, and that the boy had told his mother, and that his mother was the housekeeper, Mrs. Alcott, who had been at Ashcombe 40 years and had held Adrian's head against her apron the week his mother died. Mrs. Alcott told the Earl. He said nothing at all when she told him. He set down the letter he was reading, and he went to the window, and he stood there with his back to her for so long that she left the room. Then he went out to the stables and saddled the horse himself, which he had not done in 9 years, and which caused a groom named Tapley considerable distress, and rode to the low meadow, and sat his horse at the top of the rise in the failing light. Below him 20 acres lay drained and dark and drying. The reopened stone drain ran through the middle of it in a line so straight that it could only have been made by a person who had believed it was there before it was found. The water was going off the field toward the brook. In a small, steady voice he could hear from the rise. His grandfather had cut that drain. His father had lost it. He had not known it existed. A wool merchant's daughter from Devizes had gone into the water on her knees and put her hand in the ground and found it in a fortnight. There was no one there to see his face. There is one thing more you should know before the year turns, and it is a small thing, and it was in his coat. Adrian carried a folded letter in his left breast pocket. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that it had begun to part along the creases, and he had backed it with a second sheet to keep it whole. He touched the pocket without knowing he did it. He touched it at dinner. He touched it when his aunt spoke. Honora had seen the gesture perhaps 30 times by Christmas, and had built no theory about it, because she had built a wall instead, and the wall said that whatever was in his coat belonged to a part of his life she had been hired to subsidize, and not to enter. She was wrong about that, and she found out on the 2nd of January in the library at Ashcombe at 4 in the morning. She had not been able to sleep. She had come down for the rent rolls and had found a lamp burning, and Adrian in the chair by the dead fire, with the letter open in his hand and his head back, against the leather and his eyes closed. He was not asleep. She knew he was not asleep, because his thumb was moving very slightly along the crease. She should have gone. She did not go. He opened his eyes and looked at her, and did not put the letter away. "My brother," he said. She stood in the doorway in a shawl with her hair down her back and did not move. "Edmund," he said. He was 2 years younger. He wanted a commission, and a blank. He was 19 and he wanted a commission, and my father would not buy it for him because there was no money. and there was no money because of the timber, and I did not know about the timber. I was 23, and I did not read the books. My father told me the books were his affair, and I believed him, and I did not read them. His voice had not risen. It had not changed at all. That was the terrible part. I told Edmund the family could not afford it. I told him to be patient. He enlisted as a private soldier in April of 1809, and he was dead at Talavera in July. And this is the last letter he wrote me, and he was not angry in it. He asks after the dogs. The fire was out. The room was very cold. Honora had begun to shake and had not noticed. 218 pounds a year, Adrian said. For 9 years you found it in 4 days. I had 11,000 acres, and I did not read the books. He folded the letter along its old creases and put it back in his coat. And Honora, who had believed for 140 days that she had been purchased as an instrument, understood in one motion of a man's hand that she had not been purchased at all. She had been let in. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that was not too large. She crossed the room and stood beside his chair, and after a moment she put her hand on the back of it, not on him, on the leather beside his shoulder, and he did not look up, and neither of them moved, for a long time. Then he said, "Honora?" It was the first time. 211 days of Countess and Madam and Lady Ashcombe, and he said her given name once, in an unlit library at 4 in the morning, and something in her chest went through the floor. "Go to bed," he said. "You are cold." She went. Command as protection, every time. All along. And she had heard only the command, and now she could hear the other thing underneath it, and she did not sleep at all. She wanted him. That was the shape of it. There was no dignified word to lay over the top. She lay in the dark with her hands flat on the counterpane, and wanted her own husband. And the wanting had no argument in it, and no ledger, and no use, and it frightened her more than the debt had ever frightened her. If this is the kind of story you keep for the end of a long day, stay until the gallery. The morning of March the 3rd is worth the wait. Lady Marbury came to Ashcombe on the 11th of January. She came alone, which was not her habit. And she sat in the morning room with her gloves still on, which was a message. And she waited until the tea was poured and the footman was gone before she began. "He must be released," she said. Honora set the pot down. The gloves were the message, and she read it correctly. A woman who keeps her gloves on in your morning room is not visiting. She is transacting. The debt is discharged. Lady Marbury said, "Wickham tells me so. 31,000 pounds, and the mortgages are lifted, and the land is safe, and you have done it, and I will say to your face that you have done it well. Now the arrangement has served. There are grounds. It has not been consummated, and both parties may attest to it, and the ecclesiastical court will hear it in the spring, and it can be done quietly, and you may keep the Devises' house." Honora's hands were perfectly steady. So. She had spent 6 years learning to make her hands steady. "He married you for money," Lady Marbury said, and her voice was not unkind. That was the part Honora would remember. "There is no shame in it. It is what the arrangement was. He is fond of you, I dare say, the way one is fond of a good steward. Do not mistake fondness for choosing, my dear. He will marry Georgiana in the autumn. It was always to be Georgiana. You are a bookkeeper who has balanced a very difficult book, and the county will remember you kindly for it. And you will be spared the sight of him being sorry." She drank her tea. She set down the cup. "Adrian will not ask you," she said. "He has too much honor, and not enough, so I have asked you." That was the third voicing, and it was the one that did the work, because it came in a private room from a woman who had raised him, and who believed every word of it. Honora said, "I will consider it." She considered it for 11 days, and in those 11 days, she did something that would matter very much in a long gallery. In March, and she did it alone. And she told nobody, not Wickham, Alcott, not her husband. She went to Devis's and she saw her father's solicitor, a man named Bramble, and she read the marriage settlement. The settlement had been drawn in 4 days by men in a hurry. £31,000 of vain money had discharged the Ashcombe mortgages, and the mortgages had not been extinguished. They had been assigned. The Bath Consortium had transferred the whole of the security to the party who paid, and the party who paid had been named in the deed, and the party who paid had not been the Earl of Ashcombe. She held the mortgages on 11,000 acres. She had held them since August. She had signed the deed herself and had not read the last page because she had been 24 and grieving, and had trusted the men in the room. She sat in Bramble's office for a long while with her gloved hands in her lap. "May I ask what you intend?" Bramble said. "I intend to consider it," she said. She came back to Ashcombe on the 22nd, and she did not tell Adrian. And this is the thing she would afterward find hardest to forgive in herself. She did not tell him because she wanted, for 11 more days, to be a woman he had not been informed he could not afford to lose. She agreed to the annulment on the 2nd of February. She agreed to it in the study, standing, with her hands behind her back. Adrian did not argue. That was the wound. He stood at the window with his back to her, and he did not argue, and he said after a very long silence, in a voice that was level and low and gave away nothing at all, "If that is your wish," she said it was. He said, "Then it will be done properly. In front of them, not in a corner." She thought he meant to spare her the gossip. She was wrong about that, too. The dark came on the 16th of February at a dinner at Marbury Court, and it came because Miss Fenn had been told her whole life that she was the correct choice and had begun, in her 23rd year, to be afraid. The table sat 30. Honora had been seated below the salt, which was not an accident, and she had been given a place beside a deaf clergyman, and left there for 2 hours. Adrian was at the far end, at Lady Marbury's right hand, with Miss Fenn beside him. Honora watched her husband's hand go to his coat pocket twice, in the space of a quarter of an hour, and could not reach him down 30 feet of damask and candles. Over the second course, Miss Fenn said to the table lightly, in a witnessed exchange that a woman named Mrs. Peel would repeat afterward and repeat accurately, "We are all so grateful to the bookkeeper." Truly, somebody had to count it. The table laughed. Honora rose. She was not going to weep in that room, and she had 30 feet of it to cross, and she crossed it at an even pace with her chin level and her hands loose, because she had been raised by a merchant who had taught her that you never let them see the ledger open. At the door, Adrian caught her. He caught her wrist, not her hand, and his fingers were cold, and hers were colder. And for 2 seconds the whole room saw an earl hold his wife's wrist in a doorway. "Do not," she said quietly. "You have nothing to gain by it." And she took her wrist back, and she went out into the February dark, and she got into a carriage alone, and she sat with her hands in her lap for 11 miles, and somewhere around Chippenham she said aloud to nobody, "I would have stayed for nothing." That was the sentence she had not been able to say at any point in 200 days. She said it to an empty carriage. Adrian did not go back to the table. He went to the library at Marbury Court, and he wrote 2 letters. One was to a solicitor in Bath. The other was to Bramble in Devizes. He had a question, and it was the same question in both, and he had been carrying it since the 2nd of February, when a woman who had drained a meadow with her own hands had told him she wished to be released, and he had looked at her face and had not believed her. Bramble's reply reached him on the 28th of February. Adrian read it standing in the courtyard with the rain coming down on the paper. Then he wrote to his aunt and asked her to assemble the family in the long gallery at Ashcombe on the 3rd of March at 11 o'clock for the signing. 11 people. The card table. The pale Wiltshire light. Lady Marbury sat at the left in ivory and diamonds with her fan working. Miss Fenn stood behind her in cream and pearl buttons. Peel had come, and 2 Rowe cousins, and Prentice the tenant, who nobody had invited and who had walked 4 miles and stood at the back by the door with his hat in his hands. Wickham stood by the window. Mrs. Alcott stood beside him. Bramble had come from Devizes with a leather case. The solicitor read the terms aloud. The marriage was to be dissolved. The Devises' house was to be retained by Miss Vane. The Ashcombe estate was to remain with the Earl, entire and unencumbered. He said unencumbered, and Bramble, at the window, looked at his shoes. Honora took the pen. She dipped it. And because it was over, and because there was nothing left to lose, and nothing left to protect, and because she was her father's daughter and her father had taught her that, when the account is closed, you may permit yourself one moment of pleasure at the arithmetic, she permitted herself the truth. She smiled. She signed her name, and set the pen down, and turned it a quarter turn parallel to the edge of the paper. "The estate is unencumbered," she said. "That is not correct." Lady Marbury's fan stopped. "The mortgages were not discharged in August," Honora said. "They were assigned." The Bath Consortium transferred the security to the party who paid the £31,000. And the party who paid the £31,000 was me. I hold them. I have held them since the 14th of August. Mr. Bramble has the deed. Bramble opened the leather case. "I am not the bookkeeper," Honora said. "I am the mortgagee." "The silence in that gallery was the loudest thing in Wiltshire," Lady Marbury said. "That is not." She stopped. She said, "The settlement." She stopped again. Her fan was in her lap, and she was looking at her nephew, and her mouth had come open, and no third sentence arrived at all. Miss Fenn understood it before the rest of them. Her chin came down a quarter of an inch, and her hands unfolded, and she looked at the woman in mended gloves at the card table, and what was on her face was not hatred. It was the beginning of respect, arriving 8 months late, and worth nothing to anyone. And Honora stood up and picked up the annulment she had just signed, and looked across the card table at her husband, and waited to be released. Adrian crossed the room in 3 strides. He did not look at the deed. He did not look at Bramble. He took the pen out of the inkstand and he tore the annulment across, once, twice, and let the pieces fall on the card table. "I wrote to Bramble on the 16th of February, he said. "I have known for 3 days. He put his hand out, palm up, in front of 11 people. "I'm not asking for the acres," he said. "Stay," he said. "Honora Vane, I want you." "Nothing else? 9 words. In the same gallery, in front of the same faces." She did not move. The whole of it stood on the floor between them, and her hands were shaking now at last, where anyone could see. "You would have let me go," she said. "Yes," he said. "You asked, 'Why did you write to Bramble?' Because you smiled," he said. "On the 2nd of February when you told me you wished to be released. You smile when the arithmetic is finished. I have watched you do it for 7 months. I wanted to know what you had finished." Prentice, at the back, by the door, with his hat in his hands, said to nobody, "She dug that drain herself, ma'am." On her knees, Mrs. Alcott began to cry and did not apologize for it. And Honora put her hand into her husband's hand, and it was the first time in 211 days that they had touched, with nothing owed on either side, and he closed his fingers around her fingers and did not let go. Lady Marbury rose. She was 61 years old, and she had spent 30 years arranging the county, and she had been wrong in a way she could not fix, and she was not a stupid woman. She looked at the torn paper on the card table. She looked at her nephew's hand around Honora's hand. "I was mistaken," she said. "It cost her everything she had. In November and in January, I was mistaken." She did not stay to tea. Miss Fenn went with her, and married a baronet in Somerset the following year, and was by all accounts tolerably content. The gallery emptied, Prentice walked his 4 miles home. Wanzas. It snowed at Ashcombe on the last night of March, which was late for snow and improbable, and Wiltshire talked about it for years. Honora was in the library. The fire was lit. She had the ledgers open on the table because she was still, and would always be, a woman who liked columns. and she had been at them for an hour when Adrian came in and stood behind her chair. The east wing was to be reopened in April. Prentice had the low meadow in wheat and had paid his rent in full at Lady Day, in coin, in a purse, and had refused to leave until Wickham counted it in front of him. The Kingsdown plantation had been replanted in October, with 4,000 young oaks that neither of them would live to see cut. Bramble had drawn a new settlement, and it had taken 11 days rather than 4. And Honora had read every page of it, including the last. Adrian reached past her shoulder and moved the candle 3 inches closer to the page. She turned her head and caught his hand where it was and held it there, against the table, and neither of them said anything. Then he took the folded letter out of his breast pocket and put it on the table beside the ledger. He had been carrying it for 7 years. He did not unfold it. "He asks after the dogs," Adrian said. "I know," Honora said. "You told me." "I should like to put it somewhere," he said. "Not in a drawer somewhere. It can be seen." They put it in a frame, in the library, on the shelf where the estate book stood, so that Edmund's last letter kept company with the accounts his death had been paid for. It was the only thing in that room that was not about land. The snow came down past the window in the dark, fat and slow and out of season, and it settled on 20 drained acres, and on 4,000 young oaks, and on 11,000 acres of Wiltshire, that belonged to a wool merchant's daughter from Devizes, and inside by the fire, a man who owned nothing at all held her hand and did not let go of it. She had signed her name that morning in March, expecting to lose everything. She had lost only the wall. Thank you for staying to the end of it. If Honora's quarter turn of a pen has stayed with you, sit a moment with it before you go.